Okay, picture this, a civil war that drags on for 30 years. But this isn't a fight between two different countries. Nope, this is one royal family tearing itself and all of England apart. We're talking about a brutal, no-holds-barred fight for the ultimate prize, the English crown. Get ready, because this is the story of the War of the Roses. So let's get right into it. At its core, this whole thing was a massive, high-stakes showdown between two branches of the same family. In one corner, you've got the House of Lancaster, with their symbol, the red rose. And in the other corner, the House of York, with the white rose. So who had the better claim? And more importantly, who was going to win it all? So you might be asking, how does an entire country just fall into a civil war? Well, it usually starts when the most powerful job in the kingdom, the crown, suddenly looks like it's anyone's for the taking. All right, so the big problem at the time was the king himself, Henry VI. He just wasn't a very strong leader. On top of that, he had a mental illness that would sometimes leave him completely unable to rule for months at a time. Meanwhile, England's losing a war over in France, and the country is basically broke. This whole situation created a huge power vacuum, and you can bet powerful, ambitious families started looking at the throne thinking, you know what, I could probably do a better job. And all that tension, it eventually split the most powerful people in the country into two rival teams, each with its own iconic symbol, the rose. Okay, let's break down the two sides. First, you have the House of Lancaster, the Red Rose team. They're the ones currently on the throne with King Henry VI. Then you've got the challengers, the House of York, the White Rose team. They were convinced they had a stronger, more direct claim to be king. And here's the crazy part. They were both descendants of the same powerful king, Edward III, which is exactly why things got so messy. You know, for a while, this was all just political drama, lots of arguing. But in 1455, the talking stopped and the fighting started. The two sides finally came to blows at the First Battle of St. Albans. It was fast, it was bloody, and the Yorkists came out on top, even capturing King Henry himself. This was it. There was no going back now. The war was on. And after that first battle, things escalated fast. The throne started bouncing back and forth like a tennis ball as the war just exploded across the whole country. Man, the fighting was just relentless. Only 5 years in, Richard, the main Yorkist leader, gets killed in battle. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Wrong. His son, Edward, who was an amazing military leader, steps up to take his place. And in 1461, he wins this huge victory and gets himself crowned King Edward IV. Just like that, in a crazy turn of events, the Yorkists had snatched the crown. Now, that huge victory we just mentioned, that was the Battle of Towton. And this battle was something else. It took place in the middle of a blinding snowstorm on Palm Sunday. And it's gone down in history not just because it was important, but because it was one of the most brutal and terrifying battles ever. Get this, more than 50,000 soldiers fought at Towton. To give you an idea of that scale, that's like taking the entire crowd from a major sports stadium and having them fight to the death on a single frozen field. The number of people who died that day was just staggering. So in a messy war like this, sometimes one really powerful person can change everything. And nobody was more powerful than this guy, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. He was so rich and so influential, they called him the Kingmaker. And he lived up to the name. First, he helps the Yorkist Edward get the crown, but then they have a massive argument, so Warwick just switches sides. He kicks Edward off the throne and puts the old Lancastrian king, Henry, back on. It just goes to show you, this war wasn't only about who had the best family claim, it was about raw personal ambition. Okay, so we've talked a lot about kings and nobles and battles, but what about everyone else? What was it like for a regular person, maybe someone your age, trying to just survive all this chaos? Well, for most people, life just had to go on. If you were a teenager back then, you were probably already working, maybe on a farm or as an apprentice learning a skill. But the war was like a constant shadow. Armies could march right through your town, wrecking property and stealing food. Just traveling from one village to the next became super dangerous. And on top of all that, everyone had to pay extra high taxes to pay for all the fighting. And if you ended up fighting, your experience was totally different depending on how rich you were. A knight, they were basically a walking tank, covered head to toe in custom-made steel armor.
They'd been training their whole lives with swords and poleaxes, which is a nasty-looking axe on a long stick. But a regular foot soldier, they had way less protection. Maybe a padded jacket called a gambeson and a basic helmet. Their best weapon was the English longbow, which was incredibly powerful but took years of constant practice to use well. Speaking of that armor, a full suit of it could weigh around 60 pounds. Seriously, just imagine trying to run, swing a heavy sword, and fight for your life with the weight of a 10-year-old kid strapped to your body. It's absolutely insane.
All right, as if this war wasn't dramatic enough, it also created one of the most famous and, frankly, one of the creepiest unsolved mysteries in all of English history. So, remember the Yorkist king, Edward IV? Well, he dies pretty suddenly. The crown is supposed to go to his oldest son, also named Edward, who was about to become King Edward V. The only problem? He and his little brother were just kids. And this is where the story takes a really dark turn. The boy's uncle, Richard, steps in and says he'll protect them. He takes them to the Tower of London, for safekeeping. But then he makes a shocking announcement. He declares the boys are illegitimate and can't be king. And with them out of the way, he takes the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. And the two young princes in the tower? They vanished. They were never, ever seen in public again. So what happened to them? I mean, that's the million-dollar question that historians still argue about. Did Richard III have his own nephews murdered so he could be king? We don't have proof, but almost everyone back then thought so. And it made him a very unpopular ruler. Okay, so Richard III's shady rise to power and the whole mystery of the missing princes, this all set the stage for the final act of the war. A brand new player was about to step onto the board and change the game forever.
The grand finale all went down at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. A challenger named Henry Tudor, who had a pretty weak claim to the throne through the Lancastrian side, sailed back to England to take on Richard III. And right in the middle of the battle, some of Richard's most important allies betrayed him and switched sides. In a last-ditch effort, Richard charged straight at Henry, trying to end it all himself. But he was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. He was the last English king ever to die in a battle. So the winner, now officially King Henry VII, had this genius PR move to try and bring the country back together. He created a totally new symbol, the Tudor rose. You see what he did there? He literally combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into one flower, to show everyone that the two sides were finally united. And it was way more than just a symbol. To seal the deal and make the peace stick, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. She was the daughter of the old Yorkist king Edward IV. This marriage literally brought the two warring families together. This created a brand new dynasty, the Tudors, and finally put an end to the War of the Roses. So the war was over, but it left a huge scar on England. So many of the powerful families who started the whole mess were completely wiped out. And ironically, that actually made the new Tudor king much more powerful. It was a brutal lesson in why having a clear, undisputed heir to the throne is so important. Which leaves us with a big question to think about. After 30 years of tearing itself apart, how does a country ever truly move on?